All right, welcome to the Bears Hall of Discipline today. We are in 1 Kings chapter 7. The grandiose temple, the homes that Solomon built, the hall of justice he built, the pillars, the costly metals that they used, the temple of the Lord, the hall of justice, his homes. Solomon also built himself a home in Lebanon, in the midst of the forest, the trees. Never been to Lebanon. I heard it's beautiful. It does have treed areas, but not like it did way back in this era. Lebanon is somewhat under a curse because of the false religion that is predominant, their pagan religion. But in that day there was some sort of blessing upon Lebanon, upon Solomon's presence there, Israel's presence, most importantly, the presence of Yahweh, the God of Israel. It brought blessings to the nations around Israel that made peace with Israel. So these building projects are very significant. The Temple of the Lord wasn't the biggest building, but certainly the most grandeur, most probably inside costly, magnificent. But what made it most valuable was the presence of the creator of the universe. So here we go. 1 Kings chapter 7. But Solomon was building his own house 13 years, and he finished all his house. He built also the house of the forest of Lebanon. The length thereof was 100 cubits, the breadth thereof 50 cubits, and the height 30 cubits. Upon 4 rows of cedar pillars, with cedar beams upon the pillars. As we did last time with the cubit, just do yourself a favor, make the cubit 24 inches. In that day, it could have been anywhere from 18 to 26 inches, depending on the length of the frame of measurement, because there would have been a standard, and then they used it throughout. So just for the sake of mathematics, whether it was less or more, it doesn't matter. For the sake of your own memory, let's get a concept, a grasp of this house that he built in Lebanon. 100 cubits, so 200 feet long. The width, 100 feet wide, and the height 60 feet high. Upon 4 rows, boom, 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 4 rows of cedar pillars with cedar beams upon the pillars. They had a sole plate running around the top. And then from there, they would put the beams to the homes and the bricking and the works and so forth. And it was covered with cedar above upon the beams that lay on 45 pillars, 15 in a row. So we're talking something pretty magnificent here. This is just the house of Lebanon. And there were windows in 3 rows, and light was against light in 3 ranks. So it was up high so that the sunshine could shine through. All the doors and posts were square, with the windows, and light was against light in 3 ranks. In other words, the windows were ranking so that the sunshine could come through on both sides. Now he made a porch of pillars. The length thereof was 100 feet, and the breadth thereof 60 feet. And the porch was before them, and the other pillars and the thick beams were before them. Then he made a porch for the throne where he might judge, even the porch of judgment, and it was covered with cedar from one side of the floor to the other. A lot of cedar here. Lebanon is filled, at least in that day, with cedar. And his house where he dwelt had another court within the porch, which was of like work. Solomon also made a house for Pharaoh's daughter, whom he had taken to wife, like unto this porch. So not only did he have the house in Lebanon, he had his home attached to the costly hall of judgment in Jerusalem, and he also built his wife a home similar to this also. All these were of costly stones, according to the measures of hewed stones, sawed with saws within and without, even from the foundation unto the coping, and so on the outside towards the great court. So we're talking huge buildings being built here. And there was more than one. They duplicated these buildings and made them more abundant. One for Solomon, one for his wife, and then one in the forest of Lebanon. And the foundation was of costly stones, even great stones. Stones of 20 feet and stones of 16 feet. And above were costly stones after the measures of hewed stones and cedars. And the great court round about was with 3 rows of hewed stones and a row of cedar beams, both for the inner court of the house of the Lord and for the porch of the house. So now we're talking a little bit in depth what went into the temple of the Lord. And King Solomon sent and brought Hiram out of Tyre. He was a widow's son of the tribe of Naphtali, and his father was a man of Tyre, a worker in brass, and he was filled with wisdom and understanding, and skilled to work all works in brass. And he came to King Solomon and wrought all his work. Brass can be polished, made very beautiful, as a low melting point, so it can be formed very easily, and it will last, a long time. Then he cast 2 pillars of brass of 36 feet high apiece, and a line of 12 cubits did he compass either of them. And he made 2 capitals that sat on top of the pillars of molten brass. In other words, they were cast in the sand, in the clay, at some area where they cleared out for their pouring, for their foundry operations, to set upon the pillars. The height of just the capital was 10 feet high, and the height of the other capital was 10 feet high. And nets of checker work and wreaths of chain work for the capitals which were upon the top of the pillars, 7 for one capital, and 7 for the other capital. And he made the pillars and 2 rows round about upon the one network to cover the capitals that were upon the top of the pillars, with pomegranates, and so did he for the other capital. And the capitals that were upon the top of the pillars were of lily work on the porch, 8 feet. And the capitals upon the 2 pillars had pomegranates above, over against the belly, which was by the network of the pomegranates, were 200 in rows round about upon the capital. We're talking about a huge amount of skilled labor artistically done around the capitals, the pillars, in the temple, in the hall of judgment, in the wife's home, her palace, could call it a palace, and then in the palace of the forest of Lebanon. And he set up the pillars in the porch of the temple, and he set up the right pillar and called the name Jachin, and he set up the left pillar and he called the name Boaz. So these pillars by the temple had their own names, Jachin and Boaz. And upon the top of the pillars was lily work, so was the work of the pillars finished. And he made a molten sea. In other words, it was cast, a cast sea. It was 20 feet from one brim to the other. It was round. Its height was 10 feet, and a line of 60 cubits did compass it round about. And under the brim of it round about there were knops, in other words, rings and artistic designs compassing it, 10 in a cubit, compassing the sea round about, and the knops were cast into 2 rows when it was cast. In other words, it was not only decorative, but also was useful for moving. It stood upon 12 oxen, 3 looking towards the north, 3 looking towards the west, 3 looking towards the south, and 3 looking towards the east. So there was a definite picture here. When Israel was lined up in battle array, it was the same basic principle. 3, 3, 3, 3. North, south, east, west. Very interesting. Set above upon them, and all their back parts were inward, and it was a hand breadth thick. So it was about, put your thumbs out, put your love horns out. That's the international symbol of love. So if you could stretch that out, that's how thick the metallic beauty was. And the brim thereof was wrought like the brim of a cup with flowers of lilies. It contained 2,000 baths. So it held a lot of water. And he made 10 bases of brass. 8 feet was the length of one base. 8 feet was the breadth thereof, and 6 feet the height thereof. In other words, there was a base there. And the work of the bases was on this manner. They had borders, and borders were between the ledges. On the borders that were between the ledges were lions, oxen, and cherubims. And upon the ledges there was a base above, and beneath the lions and oxen were certain additions made of thin work. And every base had 4 brazen wheels and plates of brass, and the 4 corners thereof had undersetters. Under the laver were undersetters molten at the side of every addition. And the mouth of it within the capiter of the capital, and above was 2 feet. And the mouth thereof was round about with the work of the base, 1.5 foot of cubit, which would be 3 feet. And also upon the mouth of it were engravings and their borders foursquare, not round. So this is one part of it where it was not round. Under the borders were 4 wheels, and the axle trees of the wheels were joined to the base, and the height of a wheel was 1.5 cubits. A cubit, once again, translate that to 24 inches, had 3 feet. So 3 feet, 3-foot wheels, which would be, if you look at the old settler wagons in the West here in America, that would be about right. It was kind of a good height of a wheel, 3 foot high. And the work of the wheels was like the work of a chariot wheel. Their axle trees and their naves, their felloes and their spokes were all molten. In other words, they're all cast steel. And there were 4 undersetters to the 4 corners of one base, and every undersetter were of the very base itself. In the top of the base there was a round compass of 1 foot high, and on the top of the base the ledges thereof on the borders were of the same. For on the plates of the ledges thereof and on the borders thereof he graved cherubims, lions, palm trees, according to the proportion of every one, and additions round about. After this manner he made the 10 bases. All of them had 1 casting, 1 measure, and 1 size. In other words, he made them all equal. They were all similar. Then he made 10 lavers of brass, a container, like a vessel. And each vessel held 40 baths. Every laver was 8 feet, and upon every one of the 10 bases 1 laver. And he put 5 bases on the right side of the house, and 5 on the left side of the house. And he set the sea on the right side of the house eastward over against the south. And Hiram made the lavers and the shovels and the basins. So Hiram made an end of doing all the work that he made King Solomon for the house of the Lord. The 2 pillars, the 2 bowls of the capitals that were on top of the 2 pillars, the 2 networks to cover the 2 bowls of the capitals which were upon the top of the pillars, and 400 pomegranates for the 2 networks, even 2 rows of pomegranates for 1 network, to cover the 2 bowls of the capitals that were upon the pillars, and the 10 bases and 10 lavers on the bases, the 1 sea and the 12 oxen under the sea, and the vessels and the shovels and the basins and all these vessels which Hiram made to King Solomon for the house of the Lord were of bright brass. In other words, the metal was pure, with the right amount of other metals to make it shiny. In the plain of Jordan did the king cast them in the clay ground between Succoth and Zarthan. And Solomon left all the vessels unweighed, because they were exceeding many, neither was the weight of the brass found out. Solomon made all the vessels in pertaining unto the house of the Lord, the altar of gold, the table of gold whereupon the showbread was, the candlesticks of pure gold, 5 on the right side, 5 on the left, before the oracle with the flowers and the lamps and the tongs of gold, and the bowls, and the snuffers, and the basins, and the spoons, and the censers of pure gold, and the hinges of gold, both for the doors of the inner house, the most holy place, and for the doors of the house, to wit, of the temple. So was ended all the work that King Solomon made for the house of the Lord. And Solomon brought in the things which David his father had dedicated, even the silver and the gold and the vessels did he put amongst the treasures of the house of the Lord. So as I said, Temple of the Lord wasn't the most hugest building, but quite frankly, probably the most ornate. How many of the old castles and ornate, the thing in India and over in Persia, nothing. How many of them had gold hinges, like in the temple of the Lord, and all their inner workings gold-plated, walls gold-plated, tables gold-plated? Only the temple of the Lord. Beautiful. Probably the most ornate building in the history of mankind. And that's why the other nations wanted it. They wanted to break in, tear it apart, burn it down, and get all the gold. But in its glory, and with the blessings of Yahweh, the God of Israel, it's probably the most beautiful building, inside and out, in all the history of mankind. It's kind of like our relationship with Jesus Christ, the Son of God. It is the most lasting and precious relationship you will ever have, because it lasts forever. God bless you, friends. And we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.